All right, everyone, thanks. I am doing a very short craft chat today about form. And increasingly, I've been thinking about form because I think part of what's happening with the evolution of memoir is that people are feeling a lot more experimental about form. And that is lending to different ways of writing memoir in general, which is definitely exciting and much more open than just the typical continuous narrative kinds of memoirs that we've historically seen. And so I have a couple slides just because I thought this would be, because it is so craft oriented, I want to show you what is form. So I'm just going to read what I have here and talk about it a little bit along the way, but it is how you arrange your words. It's the topography of your unique story. So that's a little esoteric when you think about that. Some of these things I grabbed from online to put words around what are we talking about, but the arrangement of words is actually important. How do you tell your story? Are you writing in scene? Are you writing in poetry? Are you writing in an impressionistic kind of way, right? So that leads into the second thing here. The fragmented elements versus the longer exploratory summaries or scenes that you might be writing. Historically, as I was saying earlier, the most memoirs have been scenes. And for years, we taught this way of writing memoir that was scene by scene. And that was appropriate for all of those years because there might have been some outlier or some experimental memoirs, but the vast majority were scenic. And I still think scene is so important. You really need to know how to write a scene if you're writing a memoir, but no longer are you bound by the confines of only scene writing. And most memoirs that I'm reading these days have scenes, but they also have all these other kinds of expressions, which I'm going to get to in the next slide. So how you choose to show your reader different parts of the story might be happening in different ways depending on the form that you choose, right? The difference between showing something in a letter or showing something in poetry versus showing a scene. It makes a big difference in terms of the reader's experience of your memoir. And so this idea that the memoir takes its own form and that the choices that you make, of course, impact the reading experience is what we're talking about when we're talking about form. And then finally, how you execute your story, which is building all of this together, right? That how is choices that you're making along the way. And Lydia Yuknavitch, when she was on my podcast, this was a while ago, but you can certainly go back and listen to it. She said that all of her stories are dictated by form. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it, that for some writers, the form comes first and the structure comes second. And if that's true for you, that's great. For plenty of writers, it's not the case. Structure comes first, you're writing your story, you're figuring out. But for some of you, you may be really thinking like, oh, I'm doing this in fragments. What are the fragments that are coming in? And then the form part is the fragments, and then you arrange them in such a way, and that's the structure. I'm going to talk about structure in just a second, a little bit more. Here's a partial list of forms you can choose. The continuous narrative, which is the scenes, right? That's prose, they're scenic. You will see entire memoirs written this way. And most of the memoirs that you have read over the years have been continuous narrative scenes. That is the most common that we know. But over time, we're seeing more different kinds of writing, vignettes. Eat, Pray, Love, frankly, is a series of vignettes, right? They're very small, episodic kinds of chapters. Same with The Glass Castle. Same with a lot of Abigail Thomas's work because she writes in these small bits. Essays, memoirs and essays. These are less common, but certainly they exist. Annie Lamott has written a memoir and essay. Marian Winnick wrote a memoir and essay. There's lots of examples of memoirs and essays. And so for certain people who have a more, I guess I would say facility with writing essays, essays are different than scenes. I'm sure you all know that. And some people come to memoir writing and they just feel more comfortable with the form of the essay. It's not common, and frankly, it's hard to get published, but essays, if that is your comfort zone, you can string together a series of essays and that would still be considered a memoir. Impressionistic writing, that would be something like Maggie Nelson's Bluets, something that is much more associative, that is creative and sort of stringing ideas and concepts together. Stream of consciousness, I don't recommend a lot of this, but it is a form. And some people will do stream of consciousness. You could have a little bit of stream of consciousness, for instance, and then pop back into a scene. So there's a lot of facility and movement in form that I think is exciting. Poetry, of course, everyone knows what poetry is, but for instance, Jacqueline Woodson wrote a whole book, which was a memoir in verse. And so you will hear this more and more often, that there's memoirs in verse, and that is increasingly a popular form. But poetry, it doesn't have to be that the whole book is poetry. It could be that there's a smattering of poetry, like what Maggie Smith did in You Can Make This Place Beautiful, because she's a poet and she integrated poetry into the writing. And so that is certainly up for grabs. Letters. I like letters in small doses, but you will see, especially in novels, epistolary novels, whole books written that are letters. And E.J. Koh wrote a gorgeous book that is very centered around letters from her mother, when her mother was living in Korea, and E.J. Koh was here at home, and she's deciphering and making sense of her mother's letters. And it's a very compelling book. So that was the form that she chose, I'm sure, because her entire memoir is based around this idea that she had these letters in the first place. And then finally, recurring elements of any of these things, right, that could make up a mosaic style. And we're seeing that increasingly as well. People who are saying, you know what, I'm going to have a vignette followed by some poetry. I'm going to include a letter. I'm going to include a list. And then you'll have these memoirs that have a lot of different things going on, kind of like a yummy salad. So I am enjoying those a lot, and they have to be executed well. So to end, form is not structure. Okay, form is the shape that your memoir takes and the choices that you make on the page, right? And then it, of course, moves, it has a connection to structure, because the structure is how the book is organized. And so your form must plug into your structure. And I think that's why structures that are increasingly popular are these fragmented or mosaic style of structures, because people are experimenting with form, and then the structure has to adhere to that. You can't have a perfectly linear structure if you're choosing lots of different kinds of forms and creating a mosaic. The linear structure really lends itself, of course, to this scene by scene by scene. And so hopefully all of you are considering what your form is, or maybe you're playing with form. I think it's a pretty exciting thing to think that you are not limited to only scene, and also just thinking, like, what's the difference between vignette and scene, and what does this part of the story lend itself to? For anyone who's been listening, you know that I am increasingly interested in just all of the ways that memoir is exploding and changing and evolving. So form is definitely a piece of that, and therefore what I wanted to focus on today. So thank you, everybody. A little more structured talk today, and happy to have you. Have a wonderful, wonderful writing session.